page, so there may be folks who kind of watching along and commenting there as well. My name is Chris Mikowski. I'm a professor of journalism and mass communication at St. Bonaventure University. I also want to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Philip Payne, chair of the history department. And as all great ideas come about, Phil and I were just sort of sitting around chit chatting one day, and it's like we should do something for the America 250th. And Phil's like, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And so this is the latest in a series of presentations we've been doing this semester in conjunction with the history department, with the journalism school, and with Emerging Revolutionary War that are focusing on America 250. And tonight we wanted to take some time to talk about some of the military aspects of the revolution, which we haven't covered in great detail yet as a part of this series. As we go on, I invite you to put your questions in the chat as we go. Dr. Payne will be monitoring things, and then after we kind of get through some discussion with our panelists, we'll turn to those questions and hopefully have a good Q&A to wrap things up. I want to take a few minutes to introduce my Emerging Rev War colleagues. This is like Hollywood Squares, so I'm going to start with my upper left. I'm going to call on Rob Orison for the O. Rob Orison is the chief historian for Emerging Revolutionary War. He's the co-author of All That Can Be Expected, The Battle of Camden, and A Single Blow, The Battles of Lexington and Concord. In the center row for the X, I'm going to call on Mark Malloy. Mark is a historian with the National Park Service. He is the author of Victory or Death, The Battles of Trenton and Princeton. To the Last Extremity, The Battles for Charleston, and a forthcoming book that I have to finish the copy editing on tonight about the battles for New York City. Mark is also of all of us, he is the biggest George Washington fanboy, and that's saying something because we have several Washington fanboys that are with us tonight. And then finally, Phil Greenwald, who's also a historian with the National Park Service. He's the author of The Winter That Won the War, The Winter Encampment at Valley Forge, co-author of A Single Blow, The Battles for Lexington and Concord, and co-author of the forthcoming book, A Hard-Bought Victory, The Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston. Phil has also worked at George Washington birthplace, so he's got some Washington cred of his own. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
So, before we kind of dive into our topic tonight, which is really like how non-inevitable the revolution's victory really was for America, I've asked Mark to kind of give us just a quick little sketch of the military outline of the revolution so that later on, as we maybe touch on some of these topics, folks have a sense of where things fit in the timeline. Mark, take it away.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, again for inviting us to be part of this. And I hope everybody who watches this, if this kind of thing interests you, definitely check us out at Emerging Revolutionary War. We love doing these kinds of roundtables and discussions all the time. This is, for all of us, a real passion of ours. And I was really pleased when I heard Chris say he wanted us to come speak specifically about the military aspect of the Revolutionary War. I feel it's often the overlooked aspect of it. Of course, this year we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But of course, the Declaration would mean nothing if there was no victory on the battlefield. And so, we can talk about the high ideals and all the things that came out of the Revolution, but without winning this war, it doesn't mean anything. So, it's really important to study the war, and it was a long war. A lot of people don't realize the Revolutionary War was 8 years long. It started in 1775, actually, even before there was a Declaration of Independence. Of course, tensions between Great Britain and her colonies here in North America had been bubbling up literally for years, ever since the end of the French and Indian War, which, of course, Great Britain helped fund a lot of the war here in America. Afterwards, they looked to tax the American colonies directly, which hadn't really happened before. It's always been the local colonies had been governing themselves. Debates over taxes turns into a conflict over power. Who's in charge? And it all really starts getting bad when Great Britain sends British soldiers to patrol American streets. They're going to be up in Boston, and Boston's where the Revolutionary War is actually going to begin. And it's this tension between the British soldiers that are stationed there and the Sons of Liberty and a lot of the radical patriots who lived up there who were agitating for some kind of conflict to erupt so that they could get these soldiers out of their streets and they could control their own colony. Now, what's going to happen? The British, as tensions continue to rise, the Americans start arming up. The British are going to start sending their soldiers out into the countryside to patrol, try and capture some of their weapons. And it's during one of these where the Americans are going, the militias that were up there in the colony are going to come out. And conflict is going to start on Lexington Green on April 19th, 1775. First shots of the Revolutionary War are fired there, where 8 Americans are killed and others wounded, and the British continue on to Concord, where the Americans are able to get a lot more fire back, and British soldiers fall there. And then the British have a running battle from Concord all the way back to Boston, where pretty much every militiaman in New England is showing up and firing into the British column. This is the first battle of the Revolutionary War. And like I said, that's in April 75. Immediately after that, the Americans basically start laying siege to Boston, where the British soldiers are. Now, mind you, there is no professional American army at this time. These are all just militia. So they were volunteer soldiers. They kind of joined up, and so this was going to basically be a ship that they're going to build while they're actually sailing it. And a few months later, one of the most important decisions, they are going to make a Virginian in charge of this New England army. Of course, that's George Washington. He comes up in the summer of 1775 and takes command of this army, really making it a continental endeavor. So you're going to have men. For the first time, a lot of these colonies viewed themselves as separate countries. Here they all now all together fighting against the British, and that's going to be really the unifying thing for the Americans. Of course, at this time, there's no idea of independence. They're hoping that they can secure their rights as British subjects, and they're going to really think that way through most of 1775 into 1776. And then about 250 years ago, around this time, the British are finally forced out of Boston. And with the British being pushed out of Boston, there is now this idea that, hey, we should strike out on our own and declare our independence. And that's what happens in July of 1776. America declares their independence. And once that happens, and Great Britain was not about to let the colonies go. They're going to send the largest expeditionary force Great Britain ever dispatched anywhere in the world up to that point. They sent 32,000 soldiers and sailors, 400 warships into New York Harbor to try and conquer the Americans. George Washington attempts to defend New York, loses multiple battles. Again, they're really amateur compared to the might of the British Army. And the Americans really have no navy, too. So that's another really thing going against them. But the Americans attempt to defend New York. Washington's driven back across New Jersey in the December of 1776. It looks like the war might be over, just because Washington's army had almost disintegrated, and that's where the event you see behind me happens. Washington's daringly going to cross the Delaware River, attack the British or their Hessian allies at Trenton, defeats them at Princeton. Washington saves the Revolution in the winter of 1776. The British are pushed back to New York. And then you get into 1777. What's the British trying to do? They're trying to conquer all these cities. So they capture New York. Next, they're going to try and take the American capital at Philadelphia. They sail down the Chesapeake Bay and they land in Maryland. They march overland from the south. Washington moves his army down to stop them. There's a bloody battle at Brandywine. The British continue on. They capture the American city. Now, usually in war, that's the end of the war. You capture their city. Well, really important in the revolution is keeping the army together. And that's what Washington does. He keeps the army together. He's going to attack them at Germantown. And then he's going to go into the winter at Valley Forge. You've probably heard of Valley Forge, but it's this winter where Washington and his army are going to spend the whole winter there. And thousands of them die of disease. But they come out on the other side, a much more professional army, and they march out and they fight the British at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, where both sides fight to a draw. And now the British are seeing that the Americans actually have a legit fighting force. But a bigger thing to the whole British question is over that winter, France comes in on the side of the Americans. And that's largely because another American army actually defeated the British under John Burgoyne up at a place called Saratoga. And that victory helped really get France involved in the war. France, of course, England's old enemy, so they want to help the Americans defeat them. Once France comes in, Great Britain's not just dealing with, a backwater colonies. They have to try and defend their Caribbean islands. They have to defend their homeland. So they move their army from Philadelphia to New York. And then a stalemate really kind of starts off in the northern colonies. And that's when Great Britain looks to the south. And in the 1779, they move their army down to Savannah, Georgia, and they go up. And in 1780, they capture Charleston, South Carolina, and the Continental Army that was there. Americans lose almost 6,000 men during that capture, and it was really one of the worst defeats of the war. And this is 5 years into the war. And so Washington's going to send his trusted second in command, Nathaniel Greene, down to the South. There's going to be what's called the Southern Campaign, where there's going to be multiple battles as the British. They were able to capture these cities, but it's really these countryside where they're trying to send men out and try and win the hearts and mind of the American people. But uh, but really an occupying army in these colonies just drives a lot of people over to the Patriot side. So there's lots of little battles, some important ones you may have heard of. You have the Battle of Camden, where the Americans really got bloodied. You got the Battle of Kings Mountain, the Battle of Cowpens, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Most of these battles that Nathaniel Greene fights in, he loses, but he just keeps that army together and keeps fighting. His famous quote was, "We fight, we get beat, we rise, and we fight again." Eventually, the British army under Cornwallis, who's fighting Nathaniel Greene throughout South Carolina and North Carolina, uh, has to go back east to try and get resupplied. He winds up in a little town called Yorktown, Virginia. And then in really the biggest moment of the war, the French send a fleet up to stop the British fleet from rescuing Cornwallis. Washington takes his whole army from New York, marches it down to Yorktown. They encircle Cornwallis there, and after a few weeks of a siege, Cornwallis surrenders his whole army of 8,000 men, and that marks really the last major battle on land. And at that point, Great Britain realizes they're probably not going to be able to keep these colonies. So peace commissioners meet in France. And finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris ends the Revolutionary War, where Great Britain acknowledges the independence of the American colonies. And I'll say the rest is history. But I hope that gives you a kind of just a very brief 5 minute, 10-minute overview of the military story of the war. So when we talk about some of these things, hopefully you understand where it fits into that broader context.
That was impressive, actually. Very nice job. Very nice. So let me just ask: the peace commissioners who negotiated the Paris Treaty were.
Hmm.
There's some
Yeah.
guy. There's a book that just came out about him, but I
Yeah.
can't remember
Franklin.
his name.
I'm
I
fishing
don't
for a
think he has
John
a
Adams mention
monument.
here. That's all.
Pretty sure it's Ben Franklin did that peace
Ben
negotiation, Dr.
Franklin.
Mikowski.
So, Rob, let me ask you. So, with
Sure.
all of that went on, basically the odds of the war go from America winning as at zero on Lexington Green to 100% at the Treaty of Paris. How does that happen?
Whoa, that's a harder question we just gave Mark. Um, One thing I want to say that, we talk about being remarkable, and it is remarkable, but I think the biggest, to start off with, what's remarkable is how quickly American colonists, minus Canada, Canada didn't come along, but how quickly the public opinion turned from this is a Massachusetts issue. This is an issue for people who are making money off trade with Great Britain and such, and then it became a common person issue because it's the common man that's fights every war, right? But that's the common man that's fighting in the local militias, in the Continental Army. They're getting paid useless Continental dollars. The inflation rate is insane. It's amazing to me how the public perception and opinion of the common people across the 13 original colonies changes from kind of indifferent to Great Britain. You know, they're the ones in charge. They don't really impact them all a whole lot. They're not dealing with the trade. They're paying a little bit of taxes, but they're not paying an amount of tax that would really make you go crazy over it. But then as things start, Great Britain's biggest mistake, I think, is, and Mark kind of mentioned it, is before the war, the four acts we call the coercive acts and the intolerable acts. Every time Great Britain decides to clamp hard down on colonial leaders, it just turns more and more people who are kind of in the middle to the patriot cause. We'll call them patriots. They were called Whigs back then. We'll call them patriots for simple reasons today. But it's amazing how the public opinion changes, right? To be able to fill these armies. And that's why, as Mark mentioned, it was so important for the Americans to keep an army in the field. That's why Washington isn't winning many battles, as we know. I know Mark will probably argue with me on that one, but what Washington does is he keeps those men in the field. And as long as there's an army in the field, there's a place for people to rally around. And I think having that public opinion really go from kind of agnostic to passionate is pretty amazing. And it doesn't happen overnight. I point to their intolerable coercive acts as a main reason for that. But there's other things going on. The Patriots have an amazing propaganda machine. It's amazing. Lexington and Concord, the first word of what happens on April 19th, 1775 comes from the hand of John Hancock. John Hancock writes a report. He has his own ship. He sends it overseas to London a month before the king hears the British version. So the propaganda machine that the American patriots have is so amazing and it happens in the South too. When the Southern campaign takes place in 1780, they're accusing the British of burning and terrorizing the farms and families in South Carolina. And some of that's true. Most of it's not true, but it's propaganda and it's so effective. And I think having that to the Patriots cause was so helpful in getting the mass population behind their military effort.
Now you
Now, Mark,
mentioned
now
the.
Mark will argue with me on that. But go ahead, Chris.
I just want to mention, since you had mentioned the economic factors and things that were going on in Boston in particular, I want to mention that next week our colleague Stephen Pitt will be presenting about why Boston and why is it that Boston becomes sort of the cradle and the spark for the revolution to get going. Phil Greenwald, let me bring you in here. Anything you want to add to anything either of your colleagues have said at this point, and then I'll toss you a question.
Um, yeah, give a shout out to Dr. Warren, who also contributed to those letters and the propaganda getting across
Mm-hmm.
the river or across the pond, as they would say. Um, and so, yeah, it's a really cute. I mean, we think about today as mass communication and so forth, but the network. I mean, as Paul Revere rides out and so forth, and says he hits this growing network of the committees of safety, committees of correspondence that reverberates through. So if you think of like social media today, they had their own social networks, which I think is amazing. Shows how much they could work together when they had not a rule book or manual to work together beforehand. So I think that was remarkable. I also think that you have to look at we always look at from the end first instead of going from the first um, to the end. And the American Revolution, I mean, Washington, it is a world affair. I mean, with the French coming in and so forth, with what your man John Adams did overseas and Ben Franklin and so forth. But yeah, it is kind of as the popular saying goes, they're building the road as they drive on it. And I think that is remarkable. If you just look at George Washington's writings to Continental Congress about how much he is pleading for things and fighting the biggest, I mean, at the time, the biggest empire in the world, who had just come off of walloping France 12 years beforehand. So it's a remarkable achievement. And that's why I think we decided to go with that title on this program tonight.
So Phil, let me put me on Lexington Green. You know, when I talk about like the chances of winning the revolution are zero when these guys get together on Lexington and Green. What's what's the situation that morning? Why does this seem like such a lopsided affair with these militiamen versus the British Army?
Well, that's why, as many of us are sports fans, that's why you always have betting odds and so forth at hand. But I like to actually boil it down a little differently. Is that, yeah, the British Army seems, with their light infantry, their grenadier, or whatever that are coming out, seems to have the upper hand with this militia who are just town folk who come out with whatever they've got, muskets and so forth. But you're looking at a basically a comedy of errors on the British side. I mean, you have this young officer, Jesse Adair, who's leading onto the green. So the first shots are going to be fired at the command of a 20-some-year-old. You have a lot of men who not worked together before, and they're the best of their regiment, so they're pushed together. And then you put them into a situation that is volatile, as they say, as they come out. It is quiet on the route, which is not normal for a morning in New England, especially in the spring, as people are usually either going to market or going to the fields and so forth. And as they come out, the farther they go, the farther they get into enemy territory. And so forth. I think one of the unsung heroes is Parker, that is on the green. Not only does his men get turned out in the middle of the night, that he also gets turned out later on. And then a third time, they come back and get vengeance on the British later in the afternoon. What you have is that, as George Washington found out during the French and Indian War, you have these small little encounters that create these big ripple effects that can affect the world. And right there, if Major Pitcairn, in charge of the Royal Marines, doesn't ride back down the line and is at the front of the column, maybe they don't shoot at Lexington Green. But you have this decisions made in the moment that'll affect the world. And what you have is, yeah, this first bloodshed in the town. I mean, guys that are, a lot of popular myth has come up about guys crawling back to their homestead and so forth to die on their doorstep. But it is, shots are fired right in the middle of town, and it is yeah, it definitely, as they say at Concord, it's the shot heard around the world.
So, Rob, is there any coming back from that volley on Lexington Green? Is there an opportunity to de-escalate? Does this have to turn into the revolution?
So I have to start off, Chris, by saying I got to disagree with one thing you said.
Yeah.
I think that percentage is higher than 0%.
Okay. Oh, good.
In
All
my
right. Yeah.
opinion.
Tell me.
For the most part, being we always consider the Army of Great Britain this huge empire, and it was a big empire. Though I would say that the British soldiers, the regulars that are in Boston in 1775, are not the creme de la creme of the British Army. They're not here yet. Now better soldiers will be sent here later on, but at the very beginning, most of these soldiers are never been in combat. They're super young. They're from the streets of London. They are trained, but they're not this well-trained army that we have this notion of today. Not to say that, the percentage was high. I would just give it a little bit more than I would give it 10%.
Oh, okay. All right.
Just because of that, the army that we're talking about in April 1775 isn't the same British army that we're talking about a few years later, because their A team isn't here. Because to be honest with you, the American colonies in the world of the British Empire is pretty low on the pole of importance to British leadership. Um, they're much more interested in the Caribbean. They're making 100% more money in the Caribbean than they're making from the American colonies. They're just worried that American colonies leaving sets a really bad example, and obviously they're worried about losing territory too, which is ultimately important. So that's just a little bit there, but no, I think the fighting in Lexington and Concord didn't mean that the war had to start. There's instances before no one dies of shooting between the two sides leading up to Lexington and Concord. I think there's ways that they could have walked it back, but um, I do believe Sam Adams all along wanted independence. He calls April 19th a glorious day for America. That's his goal. I think that's his long-term intent. And as long as American blood's been shed, he's going to take that as an advantage to push this independence. But I don't think the war had to start. I just think because of decisions that are made, especially in London, how they react to the fighting, it's going to lead to a full scale war. Because again, the Parliament, the King, and such are kind of like a hardline parent, right? I mean, Chris, you and I are parents. If you come down hard on that kid, sometimes it doesn't end well. I'm not saying you can't come down hard sometimes, but the way that Parliament reacted to what happened on April 19th, I think, really set the tone. And I think at that point, it was no turning back unless, and now they did try to negotiate some kind of peace in New York there for a little bit. It was kind of a failed attempt at peace. But at that point, Americans wanted independence, and then once they wanted independence, um, they had to fight to win it.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the rest of 1775, this is April. There's huge tension in the Congress about reconciliation
Right,
versus going forward. And John Dickinson's olive branch petition that finally goes forward, and there it's like the king reacts poorly and doesn't accept the overtures for peace, but there could have been that opportunity.
right.
So, Mark, let me bring you back in here because this all takes place before Washington shows up on the scene. Tell us a little bit about how he gets there and why his presence ultimately becomes a big turning point for the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also just talk about what Rob was just saying about, yeah, those percentages. I mean, I do think that it is. I mean, he's right. Some of the redcoats are relatively new, but um, you know, they're professional soldiers. I think that's important to note the difference there. These men are paid for a term of service, and that's all they do is train to engage in warfare. The men on Lexington Green are militia soldiers, so they are farmers, shopkeepers. This is not their full-time job. And the leaders of the British, many of them have experience in combat. Many of the American leaders, some of them may have had experience in the French and Indian War, but many of them don't. So I think it's important to realize just how amateur much of the Patriot or American side in the conflict really is. And you're right. Washington coming on the scene is a huge turning point. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the colonies often viewed themselves as separate countries from each other. A lot of them felt they had more in common with Great Britain than they did with each other. Um, Great Britain is where they're trading with. That's where they're getting their newspapers. That's where they're getting their goods. And so somebody in Virginia may correspond more with somebody in London than they would somebody in Boston. And that's why in the build up to the revolution, there was such an effort by many of the Sons of Liberty to create committees of correspondence to actually talk to each other and realize, hey, we're all kind of all in the same boat together. And just as Rob was saying, Great Britain was like a parent coming down hard on the child. In that case, it was Massachusetts. All the other colonies suddenly realize if they can do what they're doing to Massachusetts, they can do it to any one of us. And that really forms a sense of unity between the disparate colonies. Well, when bloodshed is breaks out at Lexington and Concord, those are all, for the most part, Massachusetts men, but New Englanders in entirety. It was not a national conflict, which is why when they are looking for somebody to lead this army, your man John Adams rightfully notes that Washington makes really the perfect choice to lead this army, and that's for a few reasons. First of all, he Washington had military experience in the French and Indian War. He was, at Braddock's defeat in 1755. I mean, there were stories of him saving survivors from that, having horses shot out from him, bullet holes through his coat. So he was in the thick of it, and he was well respected as a military man. Just to remind everybody of that, Washington wore his uniform to the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress. In the buildup, many of the local militias in Virginia were having him lead their local units. So he's well respected as a military man. He has that physical presence. Everybody respected his very stately demeanor. So he wasn't going to ruffle a lot of feathers. And I think really importantly is that he was a Virginian. And by bringing a Virginian to lead essentially a New England army, is a symbol showing that this is not just a New England army. I think John Hancock had hoped he may have been selected to lead this army, but having a Virginian come up there really is going to help tie these colonies together, and makes it a continental effort. And it was really one of the most important decisions. And we can talk about it later if you want, but George Washington ends up being the linchpin, not just for the American Revolution, but really the early founding era.
Mhm.
There are few historical figures that I have come across that are so well respected by his contemporaries, that he was really the glue that kept together the army initially, and then later the country. And in addition to that, having the foresight and the moral bearance to give up power. And I think that's going to ultimately be his greatest thing. Is you look throughout history, these great men of history, they take power and then they want to use that power to meet whatever ends they were. Washington's one of the very few men in all of world history who had that amount of power and willingly gave it up back to the people. And I think that's why he did it after winning the war, and then he did it after his presidency. I think that's really why he stands head and shoulders above most other historic figures at that time.
Yeah. And I'll point to last week's program or 2 weeks program ago where my colleague Dr. Phil Payne did a great presentation about Washington and Washington's place in history and memory in history. So I urge folks to go back onto the history department's blog and check that out. Phil, let me bring you back here because obviously George Washington comes to command the army and we win, right? That's how it happens. Is that right?
Sure, if you have 3 seconds, yeah,
That's it.
yeah, that's it.
That's
I
how
think
history
that's
remembers it, right?
yeah, it's how Ben Franklin thought everyone would remember it. Is out what John Adams thought it would go. Ben Franklin hit the ground with his electric rod, and out popped George Washington and lead us to the Revolution. So there you go. John Adams makes another appearance on this tonight.
You guys are all earning
Uh,
gold stars. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
we're not getting paid for it either. So the yes, I mean that's the narrative, but I mean it is. I think it, Tim, is what happens that as a great historian, John Buchanan once said it, the American Revolution was like the first American Civil War. And you see that in places like New Jersey and South Carolina, where it's literally neighbor versus neighbor. And you have even battles where there's no regular or Continental Army or British Army members there. Um, I think George Washington, one of the things that makes him also stand head and shoulders, not only that he's physically taller, that he also adapts the strategy as it goes along. He realizes that he does have to put some of his personal pride aside, and instead of attacking like in a European style, it's keeping the army. He is as long as he stays in the field, there is a chance for victory. But the British kind of lose. I don't want to say they like the British have ADHD. They're going to go, okay, we'll go to New York. Okay, we'll go to out of Canada. Okay, now we'll go to the Carolinas. And then Cornwallis goes, you know what, let's try Virginia. And so they keep trying to find, and I think they're fed information by loyalist governors and loyalists that are emigrating into London, like Joseph Galloway and other ones, that there is this undercurrent of loyalism, and if the British just stay. Now, what happens, of course, with the French coming in, that aids it. I always find the saying that the war is won, of course, with American grit, the French Navy, a German drill master, Dutch loans, and the Spanish coming up the around the Mississippi and the Gulf. And so you have all these nationalities that help. But Washington, as we know, in any type of revolution or insurgency, because this is an insurgency from the British side, as long as you stay in the field. And that trickles down into his subordinates. I mean, Nathaniel Greene's philosophy: we get beat, we rise again; we get beat, we rise again. And so he continues to show that mantra of staying in the field. And it just drags the war on. And I think that's one of the most important things. The longer the war goes on, the less chance the British have of winning, and the larger this becomes more of a world affair with the French and then the Spanish, the House of Bourbon coming in on the American side. Now the British are going to be stretched even farther and have to, as Rob said earlier, have to figure out how to defend these Caribbean or West Indies islands, along with what's going on with Washington and so forth.
Mhm.
To put it in perspective, if you ever go to Barbados, the island where George Washington actually, the only time he leaves the country, he goes there and unfortunately gets smallpox, but survives. You can see the house and the bed. But there are tunnels there that the British will build during the American Revolution that are big enough to get cavalry down and around the island. So if the French did invade, they could move forces. And it shows you how the British then have to divide their attention, and then the Americans will take that advantage. But Washington is the symbol as long as he stays in the field, and he has an army. And I invite a lot of people to read about what he does in like 1779 in the winter of 78, 79, when there's no battles. Continental Congress makes him the commander in chief at that time, and they accede to his um, strategy for the rest of the war. They also talk about how he what's his thoughts on running like the quartermaster and the commissary and other departments. And James Duane actually writes as president of Congress, whatever you decide, let us know, and we'll vote it into act by the Continental Congress. And that shows the prestige that Washington has and that they trusted him of having those Republican virtues of not usurping power. And so, yes, Washington is in the field, but it's not the way we always write about it or the 3 second info commercial about Washington being there. So, short answer, yeah, but the long answer explains why that he's just one of many people like Nathaniel Green and others that believe in that philosophy of continuing the war and stretching it out and uh, using Great Britain's long supply line and their empire actually against them.
So he doesn't have to win; he just has to not lose. Is kind of the thing to kind of drag that out. Rob, let me. I feel like you're now our bookie or our odds keeper here. So when Washington becomes the general, and that happens after Bunker Hill, he gets named to command. Even as Bunker Hill's going on, it goes up. What are the odds if they're at 10% on Lexington Green? What are they when he shows up?
I think it's the same
Yeah.
at that point. Obviously, Bunker Hill is an American defeat, but it's a Pyrrhic defeat for a Pyrrhic victory for the British, obviously because of the casualties, and they get forced out of Boston. I think when they leave Boston, I think that really does help American morale. That really helps Washington attract more men to his army and the other army too. Um, Now, not to downplay George Washington, but someone's got to take the ulterior side here of Mark Malloy. I mean, Washington's fantastic. He won the war, but he would have had the chance to do that without Saratoga and Daniel Morgan, Benedict Arnold, and the American victory at Saratoga, which brought the French in on the war. That's just to me, that's it. I mean, that is that we talk about turning points and all these different military history studies we do, but the really turning point is Saratoga, and Washington's not there. Not that Horatio Gates, who's the American commander, is some great general, but he's got some great subordinates. Um, and he's facing a really kind of inept British general in Burgoyne. And I think, Phil mentioned France coming in, and Spain coming in, and the Dutch, and John Adams being over there trying, begging for money, like a kid would beg his dad for his monthly fee. It's really that American victory at Saratoga where the British surrender an army. It's mind blowing, right? Just a few years after Bunker Hill, a few years after Lexington and Concord, but it's that battle that convinces France, who wanted to come in the war earlier, because France. I mean, it's not to be rude, but they cared about America just a little bit. They cared more about Great Britain, and so did Spain and getting them on the American side was really what really changed that percentage. Chris, back to your original question, from that 10% to like a 75%,
Wow. Okay.
because now you got the British Navy, you got the Spanish Navy, and Great Britain actually starts to pull men from the American colonies to head down to the West Indies to protect their cash cow. That's what they're looking to do, and so that thing at Saratoga is what really changes things around. And without that, I'm not sure how the war would have gone. Maybe they would have got another British army surrendered somewhere else and get French involved. But until then, it's a low percentage.
So, Mark, let me ask you here because the Battle of Saratoga is really part of a British strategy to split New England off from the middle colonies and then kind of take care of those rabble rousers separately. And then a little later, they have their southern campaign where they're going to try to kind of peel off the southern colonies. Like, how much of American success is due to shifting British strategy and sort of an inability to pull that strategy off?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think I was talking earlier about how the colonies viewed themselves as separate entities. The British did the same. They viewed these as different areas. Yes, the New England colonies they viewed specifically as kind of the head of the rebellion, so to speak. So yeah, there was and wherever the British decide to go, they're often looking for areas where hopefully they can exploit the local populations to help in their efforts. So they're looking for areas with lots of loyalists, with the hope that when a British army defeats the Americans, many of these people who may have been on the fence or who were on the side of the crown, they would come out and join up with the British to help put down their own neighbors. It's using Native American tribes on the frontiers to rise up against settlers on the frontiers. And as you mentioned in the southern colonies, the slaves in the South, to see, there are actually a few proclamations the British officers are going to use to entice slaves to escape from their only their rebel masters to come over to the British side so they can earn freedom and fight against the Patriots. So they are always looking for those opportunities. And as you mentioned, Saratoga was because they were looking to go up through the Hudson and actually have an army come down from Canada. And yeah, as you said, it essentially cut off the New England states, and that ends in a disaster where Burgoyne ends up surrendering his whole British army. And then yes, they go down into the Southern campaign and areas that where they were hoping that, like I said, this loyalist population would rise up. There were some loyalists who come out, and there is a bloody civil war that breaks out throughout South Carolina. But not enough loyalists come out, and then as the tides start to shift in the Americans' favor, there's going to be some really brutal retaliations against those who joined up with the crown as well. Really, the story of loyalists throughout the whole country. Their properties confiscated. Many of them flee to England or other English colonies in the Caribbean or in Canada. But yeah, no, the British are always looking for an opportunity to try and even out the odds because after 1776, like I said, they had this huge army. As the years go by, and especially as Rob mentioned, once other European powers, they don't have as many soldiers they can use, and they start getting spread very thin. So they're looking for opportunities, and yeah, it just doesn't turn out in their favor. So.
Yeah. And since we're talking percentages, real quickly, things looked bleak starting at Lexington and Concord, and get pretty bleak through the New York campaign, through the Jerseys. Times that try men's souls there at the very end of 1776. Things are looking really bleak. And then,
Oh, yeah.
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, I don't think people realize how close we came to defeat during the war. When I said Great Britain sent 32,000 soldiers and sailors, that's almost the same size as the biggest city in all the American colonies, Philadelphia. If you can imagine that sight to the people there. And when Washington's army, that's the largest army he had at the time, he had 23,000 soldiers to try and defend New York. A few months later, in December 1776, he only had about 3,000 men. The others had died of disease, deserted, killed in battle. And it looked like for a moment there, yeah, like the cause was almost lost. Most of those guys who were the core of his army, their enlistments were about to expire. It looked like, Washington himself writes in his letter, he said, I think the game is pretty near up. When you have the commander in chief writing that in December 1776, you really realize how close this whole idea of independence came to vanishing. It was so bad that Congress left Philadelphia. They fled to Baltimore, and they basically gave George Washington dictator-like powers. They said he could raise his own army, carry on the war any way he sees fit. And that's when Washington does, like I said, the thing you see behind me. That's where he crosses the Delaware River. This small, there's a lot of inaccuracies in the painting you've all seen, but it captures the spirit of this small group of men, going out against everything going against them. And they win these small battles at Trenton and Princeton, but it just turns the tables of the entire conflict. And it breathes life into, yeah, what were the dying embers of the cause of American independence. And that's why I think, many people who have studied this campaign and of Trenton and Princeton have said, this is so significant. In fact, one British historian said it may well be doubted whether so few few people in such a short amount of time had bigger, more lasting impacts on the history of the world. And that's really where you see that this campaign, this military action, was necessary for the ideal of American independence to take forth.
Did you
Phil,
just
let me skip ahead to the following winter. Oh yeah, go ahead,
Real quick,
Ron.
did he just say dying embers of independence? Is that what you just said?
Yes,
Man,
yes, it's
God.
true.
Yeah.
We need to have a whole nother St. Bonnie argument about me and Mark about Washington. But go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry. There's other American armies in the field at the time of Trenton and Princeton,
Yeah.
but we'll talk about that later.
Phil, let me jump ahead to the following winter, which is Valley Forge. You've written a book on it. How much of a turning point is Valley Forge? If we're talking about our percentages going up and down, what does Valley Forge do for our scales?
I think the Valley Forge is realized. I mean, that there's people. I was trying to figure out a nice, eloquent way to say that because there's still people there at the end of Valley Forge, that is a sign that the army, I mean, continues. I kind of, I know I might be in the minority, but I detest the word like turning point in the military affairs or so forth because that's historians afterwards. Soldiers like, oh, this is the turning point. Why did the British go, okay, if we're going to lose, why don't we just
Yeah.
wrap it up here or whatnot? So they're pivot points. They're decisions made that winter that has repercussions that go throughout. One is obviously Washington staying in Valley Forge. That is a tremendous. We look at it like, duh, he's the commander. He should stay there. But no, you look at like Cornwallis is on the way out when he's called back to fight at Trenton and Princeton. Um, Howe is they're always looking at going home, or winter is like, okay, we're going to separate ourselves from the men. And Washington stays there, so that embodies it. In addition to, he is walking a tightrope of understanding that he needs to tell the Continental Congress how bad it is. And I think Governor Morris will call it an army of skeletons when they show up, but he can't say how terrible it is because he's afraid of spies and he's only 12 miles from Philadelphia. And so he's walking that tightrope. He's also having his reputation ripped to shambles by the Board of War and by Thomas Conway and what loosely referred to as the Conway Cabal today. And Washington navigates those. So you start to see Washington emerge as a political leader. One of the things that is, I think, is peeling back the myths of Valley Forge and shows how important it is as the Army combines, and that it's not the most terrible winter of the war. That is the next winter at Morristown. But it goes up and down, and that's the problem. When things freeze and then thaw out and then freeze again, you can't move things. The depreciation of the continental currency, it's actually a bumper crop year for some of those farmers in Pennsylvania, but they'd rather send it into the British because they're giving hard coin instead of money. So Washington has to also walk that tightrope of confiscating food in the forage wars instead of, but at the same time, trying to keep the peace of the people he's supposed to defend and is fighting for liberty with. But you also see the makeup. I think there's a quote, and I try to stay away from John Adams at least one time in my segments, but John Adams will remark that as the army marches on the way to what would become Brandywine in the fall campaign of 1777, as they march through Philadelphia, they don't look militarily. They don't look like an army. Yes, they're walking, but they don't look what an 18th century army would look like. Well, as Baron von Steuben and other ones come in and train, and the blue book that gets created, you also see that when the army emerges, that they get to Monmouth, and as things start to go back and forth, they stick. Or even at Barron Hill on May 19th, a small little engagement, they retreat across the Schuylkill River, and they're like, "Wait a minute, we did this, and we didn't run," and so forth. You see this like aha moment. But I also think the big testament is you see the emergence of what an American military mindset will be. Yes, there's an army. Yes, there's a few men, as Mark Malloy said, that changed the world in December of that year. But Baron von Steuben hits on the American identity, and I think that's important. That Valley Forge is that in America, in Europe, you could tell your soldiers do this and browbeat them into it. In America, you have to tell them why they're going to do it, and then they're willing to do it. And I think that's what George Washington answers at Valley Forge is the why we're doing this. And as they emerge from it, they have the momentum to take it into Monmouth almost what a week and a half 9 days after they leave the encampment.
So I'm going to open things up for questions here in a second. I'm going to ask my panelists one final round of questions, and then we'll turn to folks if they've got questions. I want to put them in the chat. Um, Rob, let me start with you. So as we've talked about these pivot points, the odds shifting, is there another moment that we haven't talked about that you think is really important to kind of help increase those odds of American victory?
Mark talked about a little bit, but I would say what happens in South and North Carolina in 1780 and 1781. You know, one of the largest American defeat of the war is in 1780 in Charleston, South Carolina. The British capture the city. They capture the American army. The entire Southern army basically has been captured. And even with that, they cannot clamp down the Patriots in the South. And then a few months later, August 1780, the Battle of Camden takes place. The Americans suffer 60% casualties. The army is whatever army was left after Charleston has been reconstituted, and more men from Washington come down to reinforce the Continentals in South Carolina. They're blown off the field. So there's no organized American force in the South. And that still doesn't, the British still cannot control South Carolina and North Carolina. And I think it just goes to show that the British lost the hearts of the Americans, and no matter what they did in the field, the militia units, the partisans in the South, continually attacked the British, continually, attacked their supplies, and continually they just couldn't win down there. And I think that just goes to show, and that's true in New Jersey as well later on. I mean, it's kind of true for the whole North and South and the Middle Atlantic is even though they're winning these victories in the field, they're not winning the hearts and minds of the people they're trying to rule and govern. And because of that, I think by 1780, even though it looks bleak for the Americans, when you look at what happens, they never had a chance. And because they just could not convince the Americans that they were going to be the appropriate people to lead them and govern them. And at that point, it's 99.9%, Chris. How's that? No, but the
Phil,
Southern campaign gets overlooked a lot,
yeah.
and there's a lot of good scholarship about it right now coming out. But I do think when you look at what happens in the South, it goes to show that the British just could not win the hearts and minds of the people.
Yeah. And I think that's worth noting too, that, the 4th of July coming up, everyone's going to be all excited about the America 250th, and, perhaps interest will die down, but then we're starting to get into the anniversaries of some of these other military campaigns that we've talked about. So there's, I think, going to be a real great opportunity for new scholarship and an opportunity for people to rediscover a lot of the war that's been overlooked. Phil, let me ask you, anything we haven't touched on that you see as a big pivot point that helps increase those odds toward victory?
First, I want to say that I think what opened the floodwaters for the Southern campaign and new scholarship was that book on Camden that Rob co-authored. As soon as that came out, the floodgates opened, and now we have all these books. So, but actually, I want to point something that it's been like bouncing around in my mind and so forth is actually an American defeat that was a pivot point, and that is the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, right before one of the last major battles. And to put it in context, obviously Washington loses Brandywine on September 11th, one of the largest by forces engaged battles of the war. He then loses the capital, but then within less than a month, he's able to reorganize. And if it wasn't for Cliveden and some miscommunication, he might have destroyed a segment of the British Army. And actually, if you read on the other side, this does get mentioned in the French court. And the French foreign minister, Jens, does mention, like, wow, Washington is, I mean, he's keeping an army in the field. And I think that's important. The larger point of that the war is going to continue. And so I think we overlook, obviously, because Saratoga is so pivotal, that's what brings the French in. But there is some mention of Germantown, which is fought there between the two battles of Saratoga. And it shows Washington still has a command of the army. They're still willing to follow him in the battle. And they just suffered multiple defeats. There was a massacre at the Paoli in Pennsylvania. They've lost the facto capital of the rebellious colonies, but Washington's got command and control still. And I think that's a overlooked point because obviously Saratoga is much more important in the pivot, but Washington on October 4th shows that he's still an aggressor and still has control of the Continental Army.
Yeah. Mark, anything that we haven't touched on that you see as an important pivot point that helped increase American odds toward victory?
Yeah, and I'll just say too, when you say American odds of independence, it's important to realize too, as I've been saying, that these colonies view themselves very separately. There's one point in South Carolina where South Carolina, some of the Charleston leaders actually debated going neutral during the war, and even those, the negotiations that were going on in Paris for the Treaty of Paris, they were dealing with all these different colonies as separate colonies, and they recognized their individual independence. And so it's pretty amazing that even these small skirmishes that are happening later in the war, British, France, all these different European powers are looking at this new American nation that's coming together at the end of the Revolutionary War, thinking that it'll probably fail and that it will break apart and that they can kind of pick the pieces off from them. So this whole idea that it was kind of laid out that America would be independent, that was never the case during the whole time. But I'll just mention one other thing, and that's the common soldier. And we've been talking about the generals, we've been talking about the battles and all this stuff, but the common guy who joined up and fought in this war, we really owe gratitude to them for the successful independence of the country. A lot of people don't realize how bloody the Revolutionary War was. Over the course of the 8 years, almost 25,000 Americans die fighting in the Revolutionary War. That was about 1% of the American population. So in today's population, that'd be like 3 million people dying. And these deaths, the battlefield deaths were gruesome with lead musket balls and bayonets and swords. Many of them died of disease, and a huge portion of them died as prisoners of war on prison ships out in the harbors. And I'll just finish. I'll quote John Adams, and I usually
Yes.
always think of this.
Yes.
John Adams is walking behind Independence Hall, and he sees a mass grave being dug, and he sees them dumping the bodies of a bunch of American patriots who had died of disease into this mass grave. And he writes to his wife Abigail, and he says, what a horrid sight it was. And then he writes a postscript that's really to all of us. He writes, posterity. You will never know how much it costs the current generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you make a good use of it. For if you don't, I shall repent in heaven. I took half the pains to preserve it. And I always take that to heart when I read that, to think about that's really who we owe our liberty to.
Yeah. So great observation there. So if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat here. I'm going to end with kind of a dark horse moment. I'm going to actually say the Newburgh Address is kind of one of those pivotal moments that if the soldiers had mutinied and things had fallen apart, everything that everybody had fought for up to that point, I think could have unraveled instantly. And Washington sort of puts down this mutiny. People are homesick. They're tired. They're unpaid. They want to march on Congress and demand payment. And Washington quells it by kind of getting everybody together. And he reads this paper to him, and quite poignantly, he has to get his glasses out, and he puts his glasses on and says, "Pardon me, I've not only grown gray but also blind in service to my country." And everybody gets all very weepy and emotional. But it's really Washington's very adamant position that the military be subservient to the civilian government. And I think that that was a tipping point that had things gone the other way, everything I think could have been lost in that moment. So it really kind of seals the deal for the success of the revolution in a lot of ways, I think. So, questions from anybody?
We have one from Scott Osborne asking if there's a tipping point or perhaps even multiple
Hormonal
tipping
changes can
points where the odds of American winning the war went over 50%.
Yeah.
Saratoga.
Saratoga. So, and you took them from like 10 to 75 with that one, right?
Well, I mean, it's all about the French Navy in Spain. It really is. I mean, not to belittle what Washington does and others do. They do amazing things, obviously, but without the French arms, without the French money, without the French troops in Yorktown, without the French Navy, it doesn't happen.
So, and that actually goes a little bit toward undercutting Washington's reputation too. Like suddenly Gates is the man of the hour. He's just won a big battle, and some of Washington's political naysayers in Congress are like, maybe
Yep.
we're betting on the wrong horse here, right? And Gates gets sent to the Carolinas as the lead opposition down there. It doesn't work out so well for him,
He
but
he doesn't have Morgan or Benedict Arnold with him. That's the problem.
Yeah,
so.
and I'd agree with that. But I would also say, when the British leave Philadelphia after France joins, they leave the capital city. They go back to New York. I mean, it's pretty much admitting like they can't continue to hold the capital city while they're doing these other things. But then they launched the Southern campaign, and I think there was an attempt that, hey, maybe we're not going to have New England or New York, but we can capture Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and we can bring those back into Great Britain. So I think they're looking also to potentially have a kind of uh, broken up deal at the end of this. But because of Nathaniel Greene and what the Continentals in the South do, they're able to prevent them from having a hold on the countryside down there.
Other questions from folks who are watching? Anything? Phil Payne, anything you want to add?
No, I think this has been great. This has been really, really interesting. So
So very good.
Before
Well,
we
with
do
that, then,
sign off,
oh yeah, okay,
before we
Fab.
do sign off, I want to throw something in about when the 50% or above went. I would say it's Yorktown. I mean, and near the end, I mean, Lord North says, "My God, it's all lost, it's done." But I mean, you still have 2 years after that before before peace is signed. I mean, I think you look at Washington is struggling throughout the entire war to keep an army together, and it could fall apart at any time. You mentioned Newburgh, maybe that's the final nail that makes it 99.9% when he realizes how much that this guy gave up for it. But I mean, I think it's getting everything together, and it shows the best of the alliance because you got the French Navy, you got Rochambeau, you got Washington. They're able to surprise it. They take advantage of the infighting of Clinton and Cornwallis. There, you see just that the feat of 50% almost of the British infantry and so forth um, in the American theater, and so maybe that's the one that puts it above it. But I also think maybe and we haven't mentioned him, so I want to mention him real quick. Maybe it's just Benjamin Lincoln. He's there at Saratoga. He's there at Yorktown. He's there. Yeah, he is the 50% that helps. So there we go. Benjamin Lincoln gets no love, so I figured I would give something to the guy who he's there at Charleston too,
Mhm.
and everything. So he goes the lows and the highs of the entire war. And there you go.
Wrapped up in one person. Mark, any final thoughts?
No, I just hope as we go through this 250th anniversary, hopefully you don't stop commemorating or researching this after July 4th. I really do hope that Americans kind of look into this conflict, realize all the sacrifices that were made back then, realize that it wasn't fait accompli, and realize that when they did sign the Declaration of Independence, they signed off their names in committing treason to the crown, and they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And it could have turned out uh, very differently. One of the things I love about the Revolutionary War, I always say it's the greatest underdog story of all time. It really was, as we were saying at the beginning there, a David and Goliath matchup. And it always teaches me that to persevere, and it really highlights some of the best attributes of the American character throughout the 8-year conflict. So, hope that you want to learn more about this during this 250th anniversary.
You mentioned that great underdog story. It's because the Patriots really had Joe Namath in the background saying, "I personally guarantee Patriot victory." So, Rob, I'll give you our last word as chief historian.
Oh gosh. Wow, I get titles now. I think not to bring a new topic up, but one thing that there's a lot of research on this too right now is this is a very violent war. We've always kind of treated back when I was a kid and undergrad that they fought far apart and they leveled the muskets and they just shot at each other. It's very violent. There's a lot of hand-to-hand combat. It's very bloody. It gets compared to the Civil War, unfortunately, because obviously the Civil War is much bloodier, but the technology is different. But for the time period of the 18th century, this is a very violent, bloody affair. And we've mentioned the Civil War aspect. You have families, you have neighbors fighting each other in very close, violent, hand-to-hand ways. And I think that gets overlooked. There's a couple new books that have been coming out about that, looking at the aspect of the violence of the war. And it's every war is violent, obviously, but it's much more violent than had been portrayed in previous works and scholarship. And that's starting to change, which is good because I think it's important for us to recognize that it was a very bloody war, a very kind of personal on the level of violence. So it's good to see that new research come out.
And it definitely blurs that line between the front line and the home front. So, if folks are interested in sort of the way this bleeds into social history, I mean, women, children, families are experiencing the war on their doorsteps in
Right.
ways that people have not had to experience before in the colonies. And so
Right.
it really redefines civilian relationship to warfare.
There's women involved in fighting. There's African Americans involved in fighting on both sides. There's American Indians involved in fighting. So it's not just white colonists. Everybody's involved
So.
on both sides.
Plenty to explore as the America 250th continues. We appreciate you being with us tonight to explore just a little bit of it. We've got two more programs coming up next week. Dr. Stephen Pitt will be talking about Boston as the spark. Why Boston? A new economic history of the American Revolution. And after that, we'll have a final panel that Dr. Payne and I, Dr. Pitt, and Professor Dalton will be on, and we'll sort of use that as our wrap up to the series. You can catch recaps of all these on the History Department's blog. You can just search for that easily online and find programs there. On behalf of my colleagues with Emerging Revolutionary War, Rob Orison, Phil Greenwald, Mark Malloy, and my good friend Dr. Phil Payne, I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks so much for being with us, and we will see you soon. Take care.